It is said that in the old days, when the roads between cities were still marked by dust and memory rather than stone and certainty, the wandering dervish Yunis was seen passing through the southern edges of Kashan, at the time when the sun had begun to soften into the color of dried pomegranates, and the wind carried the scent of clay ovens and distant gardens. And those who remember him speak not of miracles or wonders, but of the quiet way he walked, as if each step belonged more to the earth than to himself, as if he were returning something borrowed long ago. The story of the widow of Kashan begins as many such stories do, not with an event but with a silence that lived in a small house near the old bazaar, where a woman had once known the fullness of life, and now only measured her days by the changing light on her courtyard wall. It is said that her husband had been a wine merchant, not a wealthy one, but a man who understood the patience of barrels and the language of grapes. And when he died suddenly in the late season, when the vines had already been harvested, he left behind a house filled with empty jars and a woman who no longer spoke unless spoken to. Travelers once spoke of a wandering dervish who entered Kashan in those days, and they said he did not go first to the caravanserai as others did, but instead moved slowly through the bazaar, observing the way merchants argued over copper bowls, the way children chased each other between baskets of saffron and dried limes, and the way old men sat as if they were carved into the very benches they occupied. It was there, near a small tea house where steam rose like a ghost from blackened kettles, that Yunis first heard of the widow, not through gossip, but through a simple sentence spoken by an old carpet seller who did not look up as he spoke, saying only that there is a house where the cups are never filled anymore. The dervish did not respond, for he rarely responded quickly to anything. But later that evening he found himself walking toward the quieter streets, where the sound of the bazaar fades into the sound of one's own thoughts, and there he saw her house, modest and half-shadowed, with a door that seemed to hesitate between opening and remaining closed. It is said that Yunis stood there for a long time, not as a visitor but as someone trying to remember whether he had ever belonged anywhere himself, and when the widow finally opened the door she did not ask who he was, for she had learned that names often carry more distance than meaning. Instead, she simply looked at him as one might look at a passing cloud that briefly changes the shape of the sky. She invited him in with a gesture that was neither welcoming nor cold, and inside the house the air was still carrying the faint scent of old wood, dried herbs, and something more subtle like memory that had not yet decided whether to leave. The widow prepared tea, but her hands moved slowly, as if each movement had to pass through layers of remembrance before becoming action, and Yunis sat without speaking, observing the room where silence had settled into the corners like dust that no longer needed to be disturbed. On a low table between them stood a single cup, dark and simple, and it was not tea that was poured into it, but a wine so deep in color it seemed to hold the memory of late autumn. The widow looked at the cup for a long time before drinking, and when she finally did, it was not with pleasure nor refusal, but with the acceptance of something she had agreed to long ago, without words. It is said that she spoke then, not to him but to the space between them, saying that every day since her husband's passing had tasted like this wine, neither fully bitter nor fully sweet, but something in between that cannot be named properly, and Yunis listened as one listens to a river at night, not to understand it but to remember that it is there. Outside, the call to prayer drifted faintly from a distant mosque, softened by distance and wind, and the sound did not interrupt their silence but rather settled into it like another layer. The dervish finally spoke only once that evening, asking not about her sorrow, but about the man who had once filled this house with sound. And the widow answered by touching the edge of the empty space beside her, as if he might still be sitting there, and in that gesture there was no illusion, only the weight of absence made visible. It is said that Yunis left the house before night fully arrived, walking back through the narrowing streets, where lanterns began to glow like tired stars, and he did not look back, though some say he paused once, as if listening for something that never called his name. Part 2 continues. In the days that followed, the old city of Kashan continued its quiet turning as if nothing had been disturbed. Yet those who are attentive to the subtler currents of life might have noticed that the air near the widow's house seemed heavier in the afternoons, as though even the light hesitated before entering her courtyard. It is said that Yunis did not return immediately, for the wandering dervish never follows the pull of a single story too quickly, as if he understands that some encounters must settle before they can be understood at all. And so he walked instead toward the edges of the city, where the desert begins to speak more clearly than men do. There, among broken walls and forgotten paths, he sat with an old shepherd who spoke of time not as something passing, but as something accumulating in the bones, and Yunis listened without interruption, though his thoughts often drifted back to the house with the single cup of dark wine. On the third evening, when the sky had turned the color of faded indigo cloth, he returned. The widow did not seem surprised, nor did she seem to have been waiting, and yet there was a quiet certainty in the way she opened the door, as if his return had already been written in the rhythm of her days. Inside, nothing had changed, and yet everything felt slightly more worn, as if even silence becomes thinner when it is shared too often with memory. The cup was still there, placed in the same position, and again it was filled with the same deep wine that seemed to carry no origin and no end. This time, the widow did not drink immediately, but instead asked him a question that was not truly a question, saying that he walked as if he had once belonged to a place that no longer exists. And Yunis replied only after a long pause that perhaps all places become that way if one travels long enough. She smiled faintly at this, not in amusement but in recognition, as if she had heard such a thought in her own silence before. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the walls, and somewhere in the distance a flute was played in a courtyard, not as performance, but as habit, the kind of music that belongs to no audience. The widow finally drank, and this time she spoke of her husband not as a memory, but as an absence that had learned to sit with her, saying that there are nights when she still prepares 2 cups out of habit, only to remember too late that habit is sometimes another form of grief. Yunis washed her hands as she spoke, noticing how they no longer trembled, but instead moved with a kind of practiced stillness, as if they had accepted their own emptiness. He asked her gently whether the wine had been her husband's choice, and she answered that it had been chosen long before she understood it. For he used to say that some wines are not meant to be enjoyed, but to be understood slowly over years, like a sentence that only reveals its meaning at the end of a life. At this, Yunis looked at the cup for a long time, and it is said that in that moment he saw not the wine itself but the countless evenings that had led to it, all the small unspoken decisions that had brought her to this exact silence. He did not offer comfort, for the dervish understands that comfort is often only another way of avoiding truth. Instead, he simply remained present, as if presence itself were the only honest response. When he finally rose to leave, the widow did not ask him to stay, but as he reached the door she said softly that the house feels less heavy when he is there, and he paused, not because he knew what to say, but because he recognized the danger in such sentences, the way they quietly begin to shape the future. Then he stepped out into the night, where Kashan lay under a sky full of patient stars, each one distant enough to be merciful, and he walked away again without turning, though this time his steps were slower, as if something unseen had begun to accompany him. Part 3 continues. It is said that after that night Yunis did not return to the widow immediately, and for several days Kashan carried on as it always had, the bazaar filling each morning with the sound of bargaining voices, the scent of cardamom coffee rising from small stalls, and the slow rhythm of lives that do not pause for private sorrow. Yet those who are attentive to such wanderings noticed that the dervish remained within the city longer than usual, as if something had taken root in his path and refused to loosen its hold. He was often seen near the old riverbed where water once passed in seasons long forgotten, sitting quietly beneath a plane tree whose leaves trembled even when there was no wind, and there he would remain for hours, not in contemplation in the way scholars understand it, but in a state closer to listening, as if the world itself had begun to speak in a language he was still learning to understand. On the final evening, when the light had turned soft and low, and the shadows of Kashan stretched like tired arms across its alleys, Yunis once again found himself standing before the widow's door. It is said he hesitated longer this time, not from doubt but from recognition, that some doors once opened too often begin to change the shape of those who pass through them. The widow opened it, as she always did, without surprise, and inside the house the air felt warmer, as if it had been waiting rather than simply remaining. The cup was there again, but now the wine within seemed darker still, almost stilling the light around it, and the widow did not speak at first, only gestured for him to sit, as though the act itself had become part of their shared understanding. When she finally spoke, her voice carried less weight of sorrow and more of clarity, saying that she had begun to notice something unusual in her own grief, that it no longer arrived as an overwhelming wave, but as a quiet companion, sitting beside her rather than drowning her, and she wondered aloud whether this was healing or simply another form of forgetting. Yunis listened, and for a long time he did not respond, for he understood that some questions are not meant to be answered, but held gently until they dissolve on their own. At last, he told her that perhaps nothing truly leaves us, neither joy nor loss, but only changes its position within us, and that even absence can become a kind of presence if one lives with it long enough. The widow looked at him then with a softness that had not been there before, not of romance or longing, but of recognition, as if she had finally seen the shape of her own endurance reflected in another's silence. She asked him if he would stay longer in Kashan, and the question lingered in the air like a thread that might either bind or break, depending on how it was touched. Yunis rose slowly, and it is said that in that moment he understood what all wandering eventually teaches, that every place offers not a destination, but a reflection, and every reflection must eventually be left behind. He told her he would continue on his path when the morning came, not because he wished to leave her, but because staying too long in any single sorrow can turn even understanding into another kind of captivity. The widow did not weep, for she had already passed through the sharpest edge of her grief long before he arrived, but she nodded with a quiet acceptance that comes only when life has already spoken its final lesson in a language too deep for protest. That night, they sat together without speaking, sharing the silence of the house as if it were the last remaining portion of something once whole, and the cup of wine remained between them untouched, no longer a burden, but a memory of taste itself. At dawn, when the first light touched the roofs of Kashan and the city began to stir again into its ordinary rhythms, Yunis stood at the threshold one final time. The widow watched him without asking him to turn back, and he did not, though some say he paused at the edge of the street, as if listening not to her voice, but to the echo of everything that had not been said between them. Then he walked away, becoming once more part of the long road that leads nowhere in particular and everywhere at once, while behind him Kashan continued its quiet life. And in a small house near the bazaar, a widow placed a single empty cup back on the table, not as sorrow but as remembrance of a taste that had once given shape to her silence.